You know, I'm not sure there's any other modern-day filmmaker whose name is as directly linked with the long-take one-shot sequence as Alfonso Cuaron's is. But where other directors' individual approaches to long takes are pretty easy to define, for instance, Robert Zemeckis whirls, twirls, snaps, and zooms through every nook and cranny imaginable, and Joe Wright uses them in an operatic and almost flamboyant sense, I'm not actually sure that there's an easy label for what defines a Cuarón long take, other than length, and this isn't a locker room measuring contest. If there's a common element that you can point to as trademark Cuarón, it's perhaps how malleable each of them are. How they reflect and fulfill the aesthetic he's going for with each individual film.
Try one of them. Oh, no. Oh, look at this.
So I want to take a few minutes and look at where and how shots like these began in Cuarón's career, and how they've evolved across his 8 films.
Houston, I've lost visual, Dr. Stone. I've lost visual, Dr. Stone.
First up is Great Expectations, and this one's a doozy.
It was a clue, or it was a plea, or it was a tease. I didn't care. No, she told me so I would stop her. And of course I would.
A near 5-minute take that starts on a rainy street, follows Ethan Hawke all throughout a party, then back outside, down the street, into a restaurant where he dances awkwardly with Gwyneth Paltrow, and then out onto the street where they make out. It may be a bit overdone, but it's almost like the flashy kind of thing you'd see in an early Paul Thomas Anderson film. That is, a long take purely for the sake of a long take. Show-offy in the most in-your-face way.
This is Finn Bell.
How do you do, Finn? Trawlers told me so much about you.
But what's actually nice about this one is that for as gaudy as it may be, it actually has a really lovely narrative backbone all the way through. Not only does the story inside the shot have a clear beginning, middle, and end, but the movement of the camera is always motivated by character and action. So much so that I actually think you could turn the sound off and watch it silent and still totally be with it through every beat of the story. That's really the thing Cuarón understood and latched onto from pretty much the beginning of his career. For as technically impressive as long takes like these can be, and for as much as people like me have a tendency to drool over them, the truth is that they can actually get incredibly boring really fast if they're not used in service to the story.
Would you like to dance?
For example, this is the opening shot from Spectre. For 4 minutes, James Bond walks over here, and then over here, and then into a hotel, and into an elevator, and into a room, and out onto a roof, but then we cut away before any real action takes place. And it's like, wait, what was the point of all of that? You could have just started the movie right here and nothing would be different. I mean, yes, the sheer coordination of a shot like this is impressive, but to be honest, this is where I think the long take slips into obnoxious and just gimmicky territory. For as cornball as this may be, at least it's flush with the story and emotion at hand. And it's what separates Cuarón's long takes from the people who just want to mooch off the long take's popularity. Next up for Cuarón was Y Tu Mamá También. And if you thought that Great Expectations was just a little too flashy, then this one's a real course correction.
¿Tú qué has vivido, eh? ¡Ay! ¿Qué pasó? ¡No mames! Perdón.
In fact, it's here that his long takes really take on a form of their own. Shots here are much quieter, camera work is minimal, often limited to just a couple of handheld pans, and the framing almost always keeps a certain distance with very few close-ups. This one's just under 3 minutes, this one 3.5, and this one's a full 7 minutes and is comprised of only 3 camera movements. And the effect is one that not only plays to the actor's strengths by letting scenes breathe, but it really helps cultivate and sell that gritty fly-on-the-wall documentary vibe and grounded sense of time and place the movie's going for. And it's here in Y Tu Mamá También that we really start to see Cuarón play around with a couple of really interesting things inside the long takes. The first is depth. Dozens of shots here are entirely unglamorous setups that create space by moving the characters throughout the space inside the frame, even if that's just from the background to the foreground or vice versa. Or by playing 2 spaces off one another.
Jano, no me hagas esto.
Estate pendiente de mi madre. Oye, ¿eso es tu marido?
Sí, ¿por qué?
No, así nos llevamos. Es que es mi primo. Es su primo. Sí.
¿Cómo te llamas?
¿Yo? Tenoch.
¿Tenoch? Sí. ¿Tú eres el enano de Tenoch?
Here's a shot I love that plays two stories off of each other in the back and foreground.
Escucha, Jano. Viste que cogí menos dinero del que me corresponde, ¿verdad?
And here it is done even better in Children of Men.
You see, Theo's faith lost out to chance.
And actually, here it arguably is again in Roma. The other element we see Cuaron start to play around with is this idea that the camera is almost a character in itself, or at least that it has something of a mind of its own. A handful of setups here start by focusing on one or more of the main characters, but by the end of the take, the camera just sort of wanders off on its own, almost like the kind of thing you'd see in a Terrence Malick film. This is actually something that reoccurs a few times in his later films. You see it a couple of times in Children of Men. And I actually think you could make the case that the main staple of what he's doing in Roma, with those big lockdown rotating shots, is an extension of this basic idea. Either way, they were one of the main things he carried over and expanded upon in the long takes he worked on for Prisoner of Azkaban. Which, granted, doesn't feature a lot of long take work, but does feature these two shots, which were really the first time that he experimented with how CGI could be implemented so as to achieve long takes that would otherwise be impossible to capture on an actual film set.
What just happened? What's wrong?
7:30. Where were we at 7:30?
It's here that he laid the groundwork for what would come in his next two features.
I'm not gonna make it!
All of which are the shots that he's definitely most well known for and that have been analyzed to the nth degree. And you can really see him expand on a lot of those earlier ideas. Children of Men picks up the threads of Itu Mamatembian's handheld documentary-like approach, and Gravity expands on the CG shots employed in Azkaban. But again, the long takes are built so as to serve each film's individual tone. Like with Children of Men, this central sequence on the war-torn street totally lacks any kind of standard coverage in the exact same way you'd expect a documentary or a TV news camera would, down even to that happy accidental blood splatter on the lens. But compare this with Gravity, and it's totally different. In fact, I actually think you could make the argument that the exact same type of traditional coverage that Children of Men purposefully avoids in these bigger shots, Gravity actually subverts by capturing it in single shots, but capturing it in such a way that's otherwise impossible apart from a near completely digital environment. The way the camera frames, reframes, spins, flips, and moves into POV shots in what DP Emmanuel Lubezki called elastic shots is totally in line with the film's weightless roller coaster mentality.
Right. After you.
The last point brings us to Roma and back to that idea of depth. Itu Mamatembian, Children of Men, and Roma in particular all focus in on fairly small personal stories that are set against massive cultural and political backdrops, whether that's political upheaval, revolution, student protests. And many of the long takes he employs throughout these three films actually build that contrast into the very composition of the shots themselves. The background of the story becomes the background of the frame. And this is something that I think not only separates the way Cuarón crafts his long takes, but is something, like all we've talked about so far, that's evolved and perhaps has reached its highest point in his career with Roma, which not only boasts the largest canvas Cuarón has ever created, but whose most jaw-dropping shot is exactly that. In fact, I would actually make the argument that the entirety of Roma is built around that idea of contrast between the background and the foreground. Not only just with the political rumblings going on at the time that the story is set, but with lead character Cleo herself. Just as she is often lost and forgotten in her own life, she's frequently overwhelmed by the events in the very frame itself. For as much as the long take has become a bit of an obnoxious mainstream gimmick, I think Cuarón remains one of its best adherents, precisely because very few of the long takes in his films feel at all out of place or shoehorned in, but rather entirely natural. And I think that sense of adaptability is one of the things that's made him the great director that he is. It's a prime example of how a director's craft adapts and evolves. And it's one that I at least hope he isn't finished with. I remember seeing Gravity and thinking it was probably the highest point of experimentation he'd ever attempt with the long take. But of course, if Roma showed us anything, then it was a director who was as able as ever to combine visual grandeur with emotional storytelling. Because, I mean, good lord, this right here is just perfect.